Good morning to all of you. Today, this will be our last session of the conference. Good morning, ma'am, whoever joined here. We are going to start the panel discussion. It is a virtual discussion about a specific topic, and that is COVID-linked brain damage. Of course, the topic is maybe surprising for some. I would like to invite Mrs. Siddhi Riju, Associate Professor, College of Nursing, AIMS, New Delhi. And I would like to thank ma'am who have selected this topic as well as selected the speakers for this special topic. And it's very, very important, of course, apt for everyone, which we have to know about this, how much the damage may occur neurologically by the virus, this pandemic. So, ma'am, please, you can carry on and you can introduce the panelist and the topics also. And this was completely dependent on you. You can carry out.
Thank you, Anjali. I welcome you all to the panel discussion on COVID-linked brain damage. So over the last 2 days, we have been discussing about the effect of the pandemic on the nurses, the healthcare challenges, the role of physiotherapy, the care of certain diseases in the pandemic. But one thing which has been underestimated is the neurological association with COVID. So to throw some light, we have got together and we will be discussing the COVID linked brain damage in this 1 hour of the panel discussion. And we have distinguished panelists with us. So I would like to introduce them one by one. I would request all to start their video so that we can introduce. So the first panelist is Mrs. Aditi Sinha. She is also an associate professor in College of Nursing, AIMS. And she would be discussing about the COVID-linked brain damage and giving us the overview of what exactly do we mean by COVID-linked brain damage and how it affects us. The second panelist with us is Dr. Pragya Phatak. She is also an associate professor, College of Nursing, AIMS, New Delhi. She would be throwing light on the general manifestations a patient can present with during the brain damage caused by COVID. The third panelist with us today is Mrs. Cecilia. She's also an associate professor, College of Nursing, AIMS, New Delhi. She would be throwing light on the nursing responsibilities and prevention of the COVID-linked brain damage. And then we have Dr. Seema Sachdeva with us, who would be discussing about the neurocritical care monitoring of COVID patients and of the neurosurgical patients. So with this, I start the panel discussion and I request Madam Aditi to start with the overview of COVID-linked brain damage.
Chairperson, Ms. Siddhi, all the panelists of my colleagues, dear audience, a very good morning to all of you. I just would like to give an overview that how the brain damage is linked with the COVID-19. So I would like to just give my views related to it. It is completely an evidence-based situation through which I got the content related to brain damage during COVID-19. So coming to the brain damage during COVID-19, it's an overview. Coming to an introduction, in December 2019, WHO, we all are aware, was notified by clinicians in Wuhan, China, of a novel and severe respiratory virus, later called acute respiratory distress syndrome, that is coronavirus 2, SARS-CoV-2. COVID-19 was first recognized as a substantial global public health problem, public health emergency, and declared a pandemic on March 11, 2020. The SARS-CoV-2 virus has the potential to invade the brain, increasing evidence that the nervous system is frequently in patients hospitalized with coronavirus disease is getting affected. In severe COVID-19, systemic disorders like hypoxia, sepsis, metabolic acidosis, hypercoagulable states, and disseminated intravascular coagulation are largely responsible for most of the clinical manifestation, including neurological. Neurological manifestation related to drug toxicity, And because of that, the central and peripheral nervous system both can be affected during impact of COVID-19. Now coming to what are the potential routes of brain entry which can enter into the brain. So it has been noted that infection of the olfactory system. Now we all are aware that it is consistent with many of the observations that loss of smell is frequently seen in the patients. And it is one of the common neurological manifestations which has been evidence of increased MRI signal in the olfactory cortex, which is suggesting the neurological infection. Again, another concept says that ACE2 and TMPRSS2, it has been detected in the nasal mucosa at their RNA protein levels, but they seem to be localized to epithelial cells, that is substancular cells, not olfactory, but again, neurons suggest that neuronal injury is present. Because of that, this impact has occurred. Now, if we look at this picture, it is showing that how the infection has entered into the brain. This is the COVID-19 virus. It has three portals through which it can enter into the brain. The potential mechanism is the immune system is getting activated. Because of that, overproduction of the cytokines takes place. There will be endothelial damage, and through the endothelial damage, it can enter into the neuron. It can break the blood-brain barrier. Another concept says that activation of procoagulation factor. So activation of procoagulation factor, again, because of that, it may lead to coagulopathies and thrombus formation in the brain, in the vessels of the brain. Then this COVID-19 virus, it binds to ACE2 receptor. So once it binds to the ACE2 receptor, the immune system activation takes place and it can directly invade into the neurons and cerebrovascular endothelial cells. So these are the major concepts which has given that how the virus can enter into the brain, because earlier during the research evidence, it has been found that it is a respiratory virus. So how come the neurological manifestations have come up? Now another picture, now it is showing there's something called cytokine storm. Cytokine storm, here what happens, this COVID-19 is a crucial mediator, and it is these cytokines, as I told you, they are markedly increased. There will be lymphopenia and raised neutrophil. In this interleukin 6, there are many other interleukins which are responsible, plus granulocyte colony stimulating factors, granulocyte macrophage colony stimulating factors, as well as tumor necrotizing factors. They are responsible for giving rise to the COVID-19 infection. So it is just simply showing you the olfactory bulb vagus nerve that enters into the bloodstream, and through that it can enter into the brain based on these concepts which has already been explored. So here cytokine storm, why it is important, it has been noted that it is associated with enhanced vascular hyperpermeability, coagulopathies, and multi-system dysfunction, which is held responsible for various organ dysfunction in COVID-19. So this is the mechanism which has been showing that how the COVID-19 enters into this virus attacks the brain. So there are certain, those were the direct effects. There are certain indirect brain effects of the systemic factors, which shows that the respiratory failure resulting from lung damage leads to severe hypoxia. With the hypoxic brain injury, there are various autopsy studies which shows that neuronal damage in the brain region more vulnerable to hypoxia, including neocortex, including hippocampus, and including the cerebellum. So these are the commonest part in which the neuronal damage in the brain will occur. Now another we have is the central nervous system invasion. In COVID-19, there is lots of alteration in the blood pressure control. That's another mechanism that has been suggested to explain that there is an increased risk of cerebral vascular complications. Now what happens, there is a competitive blockage of ACE2 receptors, as it was shown in the previous picture, that by this virus, with the ACE2, we know it regulates the blood pressure. So once it is blocked, it may lead to uncontrolled blood pressure and enhanced possibility for occurrence of the cerebral vascular accidents. So what are the major effects? If we look at the major effect, when it comes to the brain and it comes to the nerves, the virus is said to have 4 main sets of effects. One is the patient can have a confused state, which is known as delirium or encephalopathy. Sometimes it may be with psychosis and memory disturbances. Another condition is inflammation of the brain. We call it as encephalitis, which includes a form showing lesions on the brain, acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, together with the effect of hypoxia, that is low oxygen in the brain. Another set of effect is blood clot. Blood clot, especially in younger patients, it can lead to stroke. And the potential damage to the nerves in the body, which causes pain, numbness, for example, in the form of post-infectious Guillain-Barré syndrome. So when we say neurological complications of COVID-19, we can say that it affects as, there are many evidences which shows that it affects the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So central nervous system and peripheral nervous system both have some uncommon and common possibilities of neurological deficits. Like uncommon, we have epilepsy, encephalitis, meningitis, meningoencephalitis, acute hemorrhagic necrotizing encephalopathy, ADEM, PRES, cerebral venous thrombosis, and myelitis. These are very uncommon. There are many evidences which have shown only 1% or 0.3% occurrence of these. Whereas commonest one which is noted as per central nervous system, that is insomnia, headache, metabolic hypoxic encephalopathy, and stroke. Whereas peripheral nervous system, in the peripheral nervous system, we have again common and uncommon. And commonest one is myalgia, anosmia, ageusia, vision loss, and neurological pain. Whereas uncommon is like myositis, rhabdomyositis. There are many more which are relatively very uncommon. So there are disorders, lots of disorders we have seen that it affects and damages the brain. We cannot explore so far for everything. But just to give you an overview of some commonest one which has occurred, that is smell and taste disorder. Smell and taste disorder, that is anosmia and dysgeusia, have been reported as symptoms in the patients with COVID-19, which occur in greater than 80% of the patients in their series. SARS-CoV-2 may invade the brain through olfactory epithelium and neuronal damage, which interferes signaling, MRI signaling abnormality in one or both olfactory bulbs. So it has been found that the signal abnormalities which are there in both olfactory bulbs, which may lead to these type of symptoms which are responsible in the patient. Another concept is encephalopathy. Encephalopathy is common in critically ill patients with COVID-19, and it may be primary symptom for COVID-19. Risk factor may be associated with like older age, vision impairment, history of previous stroke, or any known case of encephalopathy earlier, and then prior psychoactive medication. Even drug toxicities can lead to encephalopathy in the patient. Here the important is that in terms of clinical, laboratory, and radiological features, patients with COVID-19 may develop delirium and agitation, which requires sedation. So we need to take care of those symptoms which require sedation, which does not require. Other manifest encephalopathy with some decreased level of consciousness. So again, we have to look into whether to use sedation or not. Then it can also impact on corticospinal tract signs like hyperreflexia, extensive responses. These are very common. Seizures are described along with encephalopathy in patients in COVID-19, just as they occur in toxic metabolic encephalopathy. In other settings, the same way, just because it has a toxic physiology of toxic metabolic encephalopathy, it may lead to seizure. That's why it is shown epilepsy is very uncommon in the patients with COVID-19. So how do we evaluate and manage these type of patients? Patients with persistent encephalopathy that is not explained by medications or any hypoxic systemic factors may warrant further evaluation to rule out the cause. We need to find out and identify what is the cause of the encephalopathy. If there are patients who are with focal or lateralizing neurological signs, They should be evaluated by neuroimaging. They should be evaluated by EEG, and then CSF sampling also can be used to rule out the central nervous system infection. And we know if the blood counts WBCs are raised in the CSF, we need to undergo the further evaluation for reasons for encephalopathy so that we can rule out the exact cause of it. And the management will remain that as with the other causes of encephalopathy, the management is primarily directed towards the underlying disease. And prognosis is a risk factor of poor outcome. So it's a very a poor outcome disease, which may again lead to mortality among the patients. Another common situation, again, I should not say common because the rates are very low, but one of the other damage that can occur is cerebrovascular disease, that is stroke. Stroke appears to be a relatively infrequent in the setting of COVID-19. If we look at the incidence based on evidences, it says that ischemic stroke associated with COVID-19 in hospitalized patients has ranged from 0.4 to 2.7%, while the incidence of intracranial hemorrhage has ranged from 0.2 to 0.9. So again, both can occur ischemic as well as in intracranial hemorrhage. The hemorrhagic stroke or an ischemic stroke, both can occur, but the incidences are again very low percentage. Most often it has been noted the onset that stroke occurs 1 to 3 weeks after the onset of COVID-19 symptoms. And it has been the initial symptom leading to hospitalization in a minority of reported patients. So this is the condition which immediately require hospitalization. The patient may give you a picture of symptoms of the stroke, and once the sampling for the COVID is done, that shows positive. So that means the COVID impact stroke which has occurred and reported, and patient needs immediate hospitalization. The type of stroke and the image finding, it says that ischemic stroke is most common event. It is reported cerebral vascular event complicating COVID-19, and cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, intracerebral hemorrhage, subarachnoid hemorrhage, all have been reported, but the commonest one is your ischemic stroke, maybe because of hypoxic condition of the brain. Then another disease which can be affected in neuromuscular disease, like it's Guillain-Barré syndrome, that is GB syndrome. GB syndrome is an infrequent complication of COVID-19. Among approximately very few patients with will be admitted over a month, 2-3 months in a hospital. There are only 5 cases of GBS were identified in one of the studies. The management and prognosis is that patients with GBS in the setting of COVID-19 should be managed as other patients with the GBS. Other acute neuromuscular syndromes include myositis, because patients may complain of myalgia and fatigue, which is a common symptom in COVID. So some speculate that it can be associated with viral myositis. Critical illness neuropathy and myopathy. This complication tends to develop later in the course of action that occurs as para-infectious Guillain-Barré syndrome. Another condition is peripheral nerve injuries after prone positioning. So there are events, there are studies which has noted that we know that patient needs to be placed in the prone position for COVID. It can develop peripheral nerve, typically brachial plexus, and this position is given in terms of management of acute respiratory distress syndrome. So it may lead to affecting the brachial plexus, and also it can have nerve injuries which are most frequently at the axonal junction at the upper limb. So these are the areas where the injuries can be found. If you look at the status of myasthenia gravis, it may be triggered in these patients as a result of response to the SARS-CoV-2. So once we say it has been triggered, that means there is already a myasthenia gravis which is existing in the patient. So an alternative explanation they give it that these patients had a pre-existing myasthenia gravis which can be unmasked by the infection. So already it was an existing disease, but it has triggered the factors in case of attack of COVID-19. Another condition is Tapia syndrome, that is concomitant hypoglossal and vagus nerve injuries, which has been noted after the intubation, which has been described in COVID-19. So Tapia syndrome is also one of the very rare, which is vagus nerve and hypoglossal injuries are being noted because of frequent intubation in the patient. Other neurological condition says meningoencephalitis, that is both viral and apparent autoimmune meningoencephalitis is reported in patients with COVID-19, and these complications are very rare. Multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children. Some children with COVID-19, they have been affected with multisystem inflammatory syndrome, which can include neurocognitive symptoms, headache, lethargy, confusion. An MRI reveals signal abnormality in the corpus callosum. Then generalized myoclonus. One of the report describes 3 patients developed generalized myoclonus as an apparent post-infectious complication. Posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome, we call it as a PRES, which has been reported in COVID-19 and may be due to hypertension and renal failure in some of the patients, and it's again very rare. So these are neurological conditions that has been exaggerated because of the impact of the COVID-19 on the body. So to conclude, I would like to say that despite the wide variety of neurological complications potential associated with SARS-CoV-2, it is still unclear that these symptoms result from direct neural injury or indirect. Currently, it appears that most of the neurological symptoms are non-specific and they are secondary to systemic illness. Early identification of the various probable neurological manifestations of COVID-19 will be instrumental in deciding available therapeutic options and reducing the possible rate of complication or possible number of complications, reducing the complication in the patient, and that will help in making a clinical pathway for taking care of neurological patients in the scenario of COVID-19. So with the word of that, thank you so much. These are my references. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am, for giving us the overview of COVID-linked brain damage. And now we know that the sequelae of the inflammatory processes and the rise in the coagulable factors, they all are responsible for the neurological symptoms and the neurological damage in the COVID-linked brain damage. I would like to ask you, ma'am, one question, that what is the management of these? Is the management same as in the pre-COVID era, or something has changed in the post-COVID, the brain-linked, COVID-linked brain damage? Has something changed in the management, or it remains the same, except that we have to take the COVID precautions?
Which I have noticed and which I have found that management going to remain the same as per of DB syndrome, as per of stroke, as per of whatever the neurological condition the patient is affecting. The management will remain the same clinical pathway which was used to be earlier. Only we need to take care of the infection part of it, that we need to take care of preventing part of it. And tackling those other infections.
Okay. So the COVID precautions and the management will be the same, and with the COVID precautions.
Dr. Rajesh,
thank you so much, ma'am.
We cannot see you.
Over to Dr. Pragya, who would be discussing the general manifestations these patients present with.
Yes, ma'am, please start.
Good morning, one and all. So I'll be talking about the general manifestations of COVID-19 brain damage. So we all have known that COVID-19 has presented the world with the challenges which are associated with the multifactorial nature of its pathology. COVID-19 has, we say that it actually affects the organs and systems and presents the diversified clinical picture. It's primarily a respiratory disease, but 2/3 of the hospitalized patients, they are presenting with the evidence of CNS damage. So in general, we are all aware about the COVID-19 manifestations. Most of the patients are presenting with fever, dry cough, diarrhea, tiredness, sore throat, anosmia, ageusia, aches in the body, complaints of conjunctivitis, chest pain, pressure in the chest, the symptoms of dyspnea, loss of speech, is a loss of movement, skin rashes, and rhinorrhea have been commonly reported in the literature to be the COVID-19 manifestations. But in addition to these symptomology, symptoms related to different systems in the body are also existing. So if we talk about in the neurological system, headaches, dizziness, encephalopathy, Guillain-Barré syndrome, agesia, presence of myalgia, anosmia, and the stroke are very commonly seen. And in renal also, acute kidney injury is being found, proteinuria, complaints of hematuria is seen in the patients. In hepatic system, abnormalities with the elevation of the aminotransferases level, elevated bilirubin is seen in the patients. In GI system, the diarrhea, nausea, vomiting is commonly complained with the complaints of abdominal pain, anorexia. Thromboembolic conditions also seen like deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, catheter-associated thrombosis, cardiac anomalies including the Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, myocardial injuries like myocarditis, arrhythmias, even cardiogenic shock, myocardial ischemia, acute cor pulmonale. In endocrine anomalies, patients have been presenting with hypoglycemia, diabetic ketoacidosis. Dermatological system also, the presence of petechiae, livedo reticularis, rashes, urticaria, vesicles, and lesions have been commonly reported. So if we talk about COVID, how it's affect the brain, so and actually does it really affect, and if it is affecting, is there a literature for this? So much of literature is available which is saying that there have been impact on the neurological system and it's damaging the brain and causing the long-term anomalies. So a study published in Nature and done by Michelle Marshall, they reported that 125 people in the UK, with the COVID-19, they developed not only neurological but psychiatric manifestations as well. 62% people had damage to the brain's blood supply, like hemorrhages. 31% had altered mental status, confusion, problems with there were problems. 31% had even altered mental status, confusion, prolonged unconsciousness, encephalitis. 10 people had the altered mental state, they developed the psychosis. Most commonly reported were the strokes and encephalitis, and there have been even reports of escalation and development of acute disseminated encephalomyelitis in these patients, in which there's inflammation and the neurons, they lose their myelin coatings, and their presentations in the patients were like those of multiple sclerosis patients. A study even published from the University College London, they reported that 43 patients with COVID, they developed temporary brain dysfunction, they developed stroke, nerve damage, and other serious brain effects. Patients with brain inflammation were diagnosed with the rare condition of acute disseminated encephalomyelitis. So literature is saying that there have been the problems with the neurological system and the psychiatric illnesses also. But if we classify the manifestations which are being presented by the patients broadly, so there can be manifestations related to the ischemia, manifestations related to the hemorrhagic symptoms in the patient, and related to the encephalitis. So a study published in JAMA Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery, this talks about the different phases in which which happens and because of which the different symptoms are being presented by the patient. So in phase 1, if we see that there is a damage to the nervous system, which is limited to the epithelial cells in the nose and mouth. And the presenting symptoms because of this will be the anosmia in the patient and ageusia. While in the phase 2, there is a virus inflammatory response. And because of this, there is a formation of the blood clots. And because of the formation of these blood clots, there have been the reports of strokes in the patient, which have been very commonly found. And by the time the patient reaches in the phase 3, there has been an explosive inflammatory response in the patient because of the cytokine storm. There is a damage to the blood-brain barrier. So the inflammatory cells, molecules, and the viral particles, they enter the brain. And because of this, there have been the presentation of seizures and confusion in some patients, coma, and even encephalopathy in some patients. So if we say that COVID-19 affects the brain in many different ways. So one will be the direct infections to the neural cells with the SARS-CoV-2. It can be by the severe systemic inflammation, which floods the brain with the pro-inflammatory agents, thus it damages the nervous cells. It is also by the global brain ischemia, which is linked to the respiratory failure. Then thromboembolic strokes related symptoms, which is increasing the intravascular clotting in the patients, and because of the severe psychological stress in the patients. So the same, my colleague in the presentation before has already discussed about the pathological mechanism. So it can be by the virus and involvement of ACE receptors. It may be by the direct or indirect measures. So in the indirect, there may be the neuroinflammation because of the cytokine storm, dysregulated BP because of hypoxia or thrombotic complications which may happen, and direct is by the neural neural pathways or through the blood circulation or lymphatic or CSF. So because of this, the patients are presenting with a variety of symptoms varying from hyposmia, ageusia, headache, dizziness, diplopia to ophthalmoplegia, delirium, to polyneuritis cranialis, to ataxia, Guillain-Barré syndrome, Miller-Fisher syndrome. There have been the reports of brain insults, then ARDS, encephalitis in the patients, hypoxic encephalopathy, ischemic stroke, acute necrotizing encephalopathy in the patients. So there is involvement, there are symptoms because of the involvement of the central nervous system and due to the involvement of the peripheral nervous system. So involvement of the central nervous system is leading to symptoms of dizziness in the patient, headache, impaired consciousness, inflammatory brain damage is seen, and there have been acute cerebrovascular disease. So patients are presenting with a stroke, seizures, slurred speech, lack of muscle control and coordination. And involvement of peripheral nervous system is leading to the impairment in the taste, smell, and symptoms of vision impairment in the patient and nerve pain, reports of muscle pain in the patients. So there are symptoms in the CNS and PNS which are, and the conditions which are very commonly occurring are the insomnia, headache, metabolic hypoxia, encephalopathy, stroke. And uncommon are like epilepsy, encephalitis, meningitis, meningoencephalitis, corticosteroid responsive encephalopathy, acute hemorrhagic necrotizing encephalopathy, ADEM, brainstem encephalitis, PRES. In peripheral nervous system, it is commonly occurring are the myalgia, anosmia, ageusia, vision loss, neuralgic pain, and uncommonly occurring are the isolated cranial nerve palsies, Guillain-Barré syndrome, Miller-Fisher syndrome. It may be the facial diplopia, myositis, or rhabdomyolysis in the patient. So if we talk about if the patient is presenting with the encephalopathy, so patients are presenting with the altered level of consciousness, with amnesia. They will have inability to speak or understand the language. There will be lack of concentration and mental confusion in the patient. When the patient is having the PRES, so in those patients, they are presenting with the headache, seizures, altered mental status. They may be having complaint of visual loss. So we have to be very careful that any patients who are presenting with the COVID symptoms, in addition to that, they may be having the neurological symptoms which may be developing in them. With the patients in Miller-Fisher syndrome, they may have abnormal muscle coordination. They may present with the paralysis of the eye muscles, absence of tendon reflexes. For patients with the rhabdomyolysis, they will complain of the muscle pain in the shoulder, in the thighs, cramping, muscle weakness, complaints of fluid. There will be fluid and electrolyte imbalances seen in the patient. There may be presence of dark color in the dark color of urine. Patients presenting with the facial dysplasia will be having facial paralysis or paresis. Both sides of face may get paralyzed. In patients who are presenting with acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, they will be having the symptoms of nausea, vomiting, headache, irritability, sleepiness. They will be having inability to walk, problems with the vision, weakness or tingling in their in certain areas of the body, and even seizures in certain cases may be found. So in encephalitis, the patient may may tell about the presence of headache is there, dizziness is there, or they may present with the flu-like symptoms or with a high fever, fatigue. Severe symptoms, there may be the presence of confusion or seizures in the patient. Vomiting, they will present with paralysis or problems with the speech and hearing. Very commonly, reports have been there for the stroke in the patients. So this COVID-19, they are causing both the large and small clots. So they are traveling to the brain, and this may be the cause for the stroke, and also can be because of the ischemic strokes. So reports of strokes they are seen commonly in all age groups. So studies, one study published in New England Journal of Medicine in 20s, they reported that the adults under the 50 years of age, they presented to the hospital with stroke as the first symptom of complication from COVID-19, while their respiratory symptoms were mild. So even those patients who had the mild respiratory symptoms, they were presenting with the symptoms of stroke. So these patients with a stroke, they will present with difficulty in speech or confusion. Sudden onset of dizziness may happen, trouble walking or loss of balance. Sudden onset of weakness or numbness on one side of body can be seen. There will be difficulty with the vision in one or both eyes. Sudden severe headache may happen to the patient. So monitoring for these is important. So we have to be fast for this. So check for the balance. So loss of balance, any headache, dizziness in the patient, or a patient is complaining of sudden loss of vision in one or both eyes. For the face, does the patient's face is looking uneven or drooping on one side? For the arm, any presence of weakness in the arm, we have to monitor. Then check for the speech difficulty, so person is not able to speak. There have also been presentations of subdural hemorrhage in the patient very commonly. So patients with subdural hemorrhage will be having the problem with the dizziness. They will have headache, nausea, they will have vomiting, presence of seizures, sleepiness, or loss of consciousness, confusion. There may be problem with the balance and the walking in the patient. Also, there have been reports of seizures in the patient. There will be, these patients with the seizures will have the uncontrolled jerking movements of the arms, legs. They may have fear, anxiety, a staring spell in the patient. There may be episode of a temporary confusion in the patient, or loss of consciousness or awareness, or in some patients it may also proceed to the status epilepticus. So where one after the other there will be a episode of seizure which will be continuing in the patient. So we can say that there have been many symptomatologies in the patients presenting. So those patients with COVID-19 may vary from their mild headache to severe symptomatologies like seizures, respiratory problems. So we have to continuously monitor them. So so if I conclude that the presentation of neurological symptoms in COVID-19 cases, they may vary from mild headache to severe symptoms, leaving the permanent neurological disabilities in these patients. So early recognition and identification of these neurological symptoms and their timely management, this can avoid any serious long-term disabilities in these patients. And we have to monitor every patient diagnosed with COVID positive for development of these symptomatologies, because right from the complaint of just minor headache to the development of seizures, to the development of stroke, patients are presenting with wide variety of manifestations. So with this, I thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pragya, for enlightening us on the general manifestations a patient with COVID can present in for brain damage. So one thing which came out from your presentation was the patients with mild COVID. Can they also develop the neurological symptoms?
Mild COVID, depending on what symptoms the patients are presenting, like if they are just presenting with a symptom of is only symptom of no symptomatology is present in these patients and no hypoxia is there, so then chances become less. But those patients who are having the symptomatology of hypoxia or severity is there, then the chances goes much higher for developing the neurological symptoms in these patients.
Thank you, ma'am, once again for the exhaustive presentation. The next panelist with us is Cecilia, madam. She would be discussing about the nursing management and the prevention of COVID-linked brain damage.
Yeah, in this session, both the previous sessions, we were seeing about what is COVID-related brain damage and what is the sequelae, all that. In this, as such, for nursing, the nursing considerations that has to be taken and how to prevent COVID-related brain damage. Nursing considerations, when we see, the first and foremost thing is like to protect self. We have seen this COVID-19 to be killing many, like it has been led to fatalities in the healthcare professionals too. So we know the main mode of transmission is through droplet and aerosol. So the first and foremost duty is to protect self by using adequate PPE, and there should not be any compromise in using PPE. And the nursing personnel who are working with the COVID patients have to ensure themselves that they are adequately using personal protective equipments and exposing themselves to COVID-19 patients. Then emotional intelligence is very essential during the time of pandemic. Like when a patient is suffering, the natural instinct that a nurse gets is to immediately go and help the patient and do the needful or provide care for the patient. That has to be taken care of. Like they have to protect themselves first, wear adequate PPE, take time for donning and doffing, and then they have to provide care for the patient. Since this is an airborne transmission, airborne precautions has to be taken care of, like negative pressure rooms. If available, the patient should be kept in negative pressure rooms, and also N95 masks or powdered air purifying respirator should be used by the healthcare professionals. Then minimizing care by clustering visits. In order that the nursing personnel protect themselves, they need not visit or spend time with the patient. The duration of exposure with the patient has to be reduced. That can be done in case of like clustering things, medications, another care or advice, whatever has to be given has to be clustered together, and so the minimal exposure is done with the patients. Next, while coming to the assessment part of COVID-19 patients or related to neuro brain damage, the important things that we need to measure is the vital signs. Vital signs temperature, as we all know, fever is presenting, then pulse and respiration also has to be checked. Saturation here, we receive the patient or in the ICU or in the ward, if the patient is connected to a saturation monitor, there are possibilities that you can find the patient to be comfortable, but their saturations will be around 30 to 40. This is called as happy hypoxic state. This has to be monitored. So the patient will not show manifestations, and this will result in brain damage. Then assess for signs of clotting, like we were discussing, there were talks on stroke, all that. So for unilateral swelling or redness has to be assessed. This indicates that the patient is prone for a stroke. Then for psychosis, there is a case incident which I was going through in the literature. A 50-year-old woman who had no other symptoms, previous history of any illness or psychological related morbidity, has reported with psychosis. She has been saying that like someone is attacking and all those stuffs. So all these symptoms can also manifest. So the patients may have confusion, headache, then seizures or loss of smell of taste. They will have trouble focusing even in the ward setup. When they are there with, they might develop this trouble focusing and also change in behavior. All these has to be noted and reported so that early management is done. And ventilated patient, when Aditi ma'am was talking, she told prone position is preferred, like to treat acute respiratory distress syndrome. Proning is preferred, and while proning, it is nurses as such have to do a teamwork. It is not one person will not be able to prone the position patient in ventilator, and also they have to, the nursing care aspect, they have to take care to avoid complications which results in turning the patient like line removal and also pressure injuries. All these has to be taken care of. And an important point that has to be noted by nurses while taking care of ventilated patients, aggressive IV fluid resuscitation has to be avoided. Why it has to be avoided? In the sense to prevent hypoxia, which occurs due to mild pulmonary edema. The neurological complications of COVID, there's an article which says that neurological complications of COVID are treatable. Since COVID is a new disease entity as such, it's only 1 year plus old, and everything is under research, and there are a lot of findings which come out day in and day out. So with the research evidences, they say that improves this neurological complications improves with intensive training, which include lifestyle changes, and by giving heart healthy diets, regular physical activity, stress reduction, improved sleep, biofeedback, and brain rehabilitation. So we'll just see what is it like. Heart healthy diet, which as nurses we should encourage the patients, and also to eat fresh and unprocessed foods. Like why fresh and unprocessed fruits, foods, fresh foods when they consume, then it's like they should prefer eating raw vegetables and fruits, which will help in their promote their health. Drink enough water, encourage the patient to drink enough water, which maintains their health, to eliminate waste materials from their body, and eat moderate amount of fats and oil. Here it is advised that these patients should eat unsaturated fatty acids rather than saturated, like unsaturated in case of fish and all that. In saturated, like ghee, all those has to be avoided. Eat less sugar and salt. They say that these has to be eaten less. Then avoid eating out. Actually, this transmission is through because of aerosol, so it is better to give outside food for patients so that they are able to maintain their health. Then regular physical activity, like for hospitalized patients, it is there are many evidences saying that too much of physical activity can also lead to brain damage, and too less also does not help progress. So regular aerobic exercises which are scheduled, like it has to be increased progressively so that it doesn't cause any harm to the patient, and depending on the tolerance of the patient, it has to be modified. So the effects of physical activity, like it increases the oxygen supply to the brain, release of hormones which are initiated and they due to physical activity, and that aids in the growth of brain cells. Then physical activity also promotes brain plasticity by stimulating growth of new connections, and also it promotes cognitive ability of the patient. So it is ideal to allow the patient or to ask the patient to do little physical activity in the form of aerobic exercises like stretching, simple, all that, even in the hospital setup, in order to promote their health. Stress reduction. Overall, stress has been a contributing factor for all illnesses. And the stress that is caused by COVID-19, like in the initial stages, also, there are a lot of deaths all over. So, whoever gets COVID-19, they were like in their deathbed. So, that part has become crucial for other neurological illnesses and all other illnesses. So it is ideal to establish some control over the situation, in the sense, if we have routines in the ward, we can schedule it so that the patient has feels like he has the control over the situation. Okay, then should ensure that the patient has a good sleep. So sleep, to ensure that certain habits has to be explained to the patient so that he gets a good sleep. And the patient should also be informed that he can seek help of the healthcare professionals and also the family members when they need. It is always stress. If we feel it is stressful, then it is stress. It is all our perception. So help the patient to change attitude towards stress, like explaining or orienting him to introducing to patients who have come out of COVID-19 illness. Then biofeedback therapy. This biofeedback therapy, this is a technique that trains people to improve their health by controlling certain bodily processes. This is done by a therapist, which includes deep breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, guided imagery, that is like concentration on a specific image to focus your mind and make you feel more relaxed. And also meditation is involved in this biofeedback therapy. So these all, what does it do? It helps the patient to focus their thoughts and to let their negative emotions go away. So it helps to control their bodily processes, which usually happens involuntarily, such as heart rate, blood pressure, muscle tension, and skin temperature. So, this can also be taught to the patient, and the therapist can help so that they are able to have a better life. Then brain rehabilitation. Brain rehabilitation is a big process. Like, it is the process of CNS rehabilitation. When you see, there are a lot of things, as you are all neurological nurses. So I think these the brain rehabilitation procedures helps to improve the functioning of the patient. Like, they are able to live a near normal life and increase the quality of life and support self management also. So prevention of brain damage due to COVID, it is isolation and preventive measures. From day one when this came, like, it is all spread through aerosol. It is there were a lot of lockdowns which happened, and a lot of measures taken by the government and self-initiation measures. All those were all preventive measures, and which has to be continued, so that it is the incidence of it is reduced, and prevention of damage, also brain damage, is prevented. Isolation, if a person in a family is being affected and the person has to be isolated, that we do practice in the ward setup too. So we have to reinforce all these measures to the family and the patient. Early diagnosis and treatment is vital. Early diagnosis, when it is done, and when treatment is given, supportive treatment is given, it prevents from further brain damage and all those sequelae. Family and psychological support is very essential for the patient, which as we saw, like stress, all those can be prevented, and the patient can cope up with their condition to regain their near health. So to conclude, I would like to say, like it is very essential as healthcare professionals, nurses, we should ensure that nurses should wear adequate personal protective equipments. No compromise in that. No, for what's sake, irrespective of the instinct, irrespective of the patient condition, take time for donning and doffing. There are various measures taken by different institutes in ensuring that their staff are using personal protective equipments properly. All those are very important. It's really disheartening to hear that a lot of healthcare professionals lost their lives in this battle with COVID, the pandemic. So it is ideal to protect self. Then assessment and early diagnosis. For even neurological complications, it is very essential to assess the complications at an early stage to prevent further damage. And also, COVID-19 as such also needs an early assessment and treatment. Then symptomatic treatment, there's no specific, I was going through literature and Medscape, PubMed, everything. There's no symptomatic treatment strategy or protocol that has been given for nursing management. It is all depending on their sequelae, what according to the needs of the patient. So symptomatic treatment, which is usually done for brain damage, has to be done. Then psychosocial support, Psychosocial support as such for the patient and the family, it is important. At times, the caregivers do need psychosocial support. So that support can be ensured by um, giving various supportive measures like introducing them or telling them, informing them about the various people who have come out of the situation, and also by giving them measures like calling when they can, when they are in need. All those measures can ensure psychosocial support to the patient. So these are my references. And I would like to say, let's train our brain on prevention and protection rather than to go for treatment. So with this, I would like to thank the organizers and Madam Sibi for the opportunity.
Thank you, Madam Cecilia, for enlightening us on the nursing management and the prevention of COVID-linked brain damage. So one thing Madam has rightly pointed out is the first protection of self and then protection of others. So because if we are not well, we will not be in a state to take good care of the patients affected, irrespective of whether it is a brain damage or a kidney damage or whatever. So first and foremost is protection of self, or the nursing staff should maintain and promote their own health. And then of course, the promotion of the patient's health is foremost. And with that, Madam also pointed out about the importance of physical therapy. So I would like to ask Madam, physical therapy in COVID-19 patients, how can we ensure that the physical therapy is maintained, like early ambulation?
Yes.
Early ambulation of patient's health. Yes,
am
madam.
I audible? Yeah. Actually, physical therapy can be given to patients like in the form of video. Frequent contacts has to be avoided by the nursing personnel to protect self. So videos can be displayed, and it can be sent to their WhatsApp. Nowadays, everyone is having WhatsApp. So ensuring that the practice can also be monitored. Like whenever visiting the patient, the nurses can ensure that they do it. Okay, simple stretching exercises, all that, so that it is practiced.
Yes, thank you. So in a nutshell, the physical activity in the ward constraints can also be done, and it goes a long way in promoting the health. Thank you, madam, once again. Now we move on to the next panelist. We have Dr. Seema Sachdeva with us, who would be discussing about the neurocritical care monitoring in patients. Over to you, madam.
Thank you, Sibi. Is my screen visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So the topic which is given to me is neurocritical monitoring in COVID-19 patient. So before I start, I would like to highlight that neurocritical monitoring is a multimodal approach. It's not the single investigation or single diagnostic test, but it involves multiple interventions, multiple diagnostic tests. It can be invasive, it can be non-invasive monitoring, just to pick up the clues which will help to identify what are the ischemic changes which is happening into the brain, the one which can lead to the brain damage. So that timely, with this monitoring, timely that warnings or the signs or the clues can be picked up, and we can provide the therapeutic intervention to the patient and save the life of the patient. So with this, I will start my presentation. So COVID-19 is caused by severe acute respiratory coronavirus 2, which is a rampant pandemic, and it has affected the complete world. It is primarily a disease of respiratory system, which can lead to dry cough, fever, fatigue, and respiratory failure. So here it can bring the hypoxic changes into the respiratory system. But the recent data, it suggests that COVID-19 is not only confined to airways, but it is also associated with hypercoagulable state, which can cause the cardiovascular and neurological complications. So what does COVID-19, this virus do? Virus does, it brings the inflammatory changes, which can cause the multiple clots are formed into the microvascular structures of the cardiovascular and neurological vasculature, which can lead to the complications. So it can lead to cerebral venous thrombosis and intracerebral hemorrhage. These small clots, it can lead to the hemorrhage. COVID-19 and stroke. COVID-19 has been found to cause the blood clots because it bring the microvascular changes. It form the clots because of the inflammatory changes. It can be both large clot and small clot. And these clots can travel to brain and it can cause a stroke. Stroke has occurred in COVID-19 patients of all ages, but but it is more found in the adults who are less than 50 years. So in COVID-19, we have seen that people who are less than 50 years of age, there are more chances of stroke. They have presented to the hospital with a stroke as their first complication, while their respiratory symptoms are very mild. Like they just presented with a dry cough, small little fever, and that cough was there. But the symptoms of stroke, like dizziness, headache, or hemiplegia, so these symptoms were presented in these patients, and the age was, in most of the patients, the age was less than 50 years. And the patient who had this ischemic stroke, the mortality was quite high as compared to the patient who was not having this ischemic stroke. So this study I have taken from New England Journal of Medicine. Now coming to the route of transmission, coronavirus, it may spread to the central nervous system by hematogenous spread from the systemic to the cerebral circulation. So this neurological manifestation of COVID-19 are highly variable. Like most of the patient, they present the neurological symptoms in the initial stage only, while sometimes even if they are not being diagnosed for the neurological problems, or some patient they are diagnosed, they come up to the emergency ward with that neurological symptoms. So it is highly variable. So this is a route of transmission. Like the virus can be there in the, as we know that it is through the droplet infection, and the virus can be there in the upper respiratory tract, and it can travel to the lower respiratory tract. In the upper respiratory tract, olfactory nerve cells in the nasal epithelium, there is a transmission of virus to the brain through the axonal transmission route. Or if the virus moves to the lower respiratory tract, these infected monocytes, macrophages in the lung capillaries, it moves through the hematogenous transmission route to the brain. So from this respiratory channel, it moves to the brain, either through the hematogenous spread or through the axonal transmission route. So it brings, as it has already been explained by the earlier presenter, that the virus brings the inflammatory changes which can cause the respiratory failure, and it can lead to hypoxia. Because of hypoxia, there is a hypotension, and this hypotension, it leads to decreased cerebral blood flow and decreased cerebral perfusion pressure. Because of this decreased cerebral perfusion, which is less than, once it becomes less than 50 mmHg, there is a decreased perfusion to the brain. So it brings the hypoxic changes into the brain, and there is a loss of brain function. Now, neurological symptoms, the common neurological symptom, like Systemic Review of 37 article, they have shown that most of the symptoms are because of hypoxic ischemic changes. These hypoxic ischemic changes are because of the inflammatory response which is caused by the virus. So these are the main drivers of neurological symptoms. Most of the patients, they were having anosmia, that is a loss of smell. 60% of patients, they experienced ageusia, that was a taste disorder. Patient was not having a feeling of, and patient was not feeling the taste into the food. Or 25% they were having myalgia, complete body ache, or 20% of patients, they were having the headache. Like these symptoms were there. These were the most common symptoms which we have seen into the COVID-19 patient with the neurological symptoms. Now coming to my topic, that is inpatient care of neurocritical ill COVID-19 patient. So the first and the foremost thing is pre-admission screening for testing contagious illness. Once the patient comes to the ED with the neurological symptoms, like the patient is coming with a headache or the seizures, or like left side or right side hemiplegia, hemiparesis, or incoordination, the first and foremost thing is we have to screen the patient whether the patient is having COVID-19 or not. Because if the patient is found to be COVID-19, then he needs to be kept into a specific area, like so that the transmission is not to the other normal patients, the one who are there in the hospital. So time sensitive triage. Triage is sorting the patient based upon his severity of illness, and neurocritical treatment for the patient with neurological symptoms. So change the physical location of neurocritical care unit. If the patient is found to be COVID-19, then we have to specify a particular area where these type of patient, the one which is dedicated for COVID-19 patient. like in AIMS, we have specified the trauma center for the COVID-19 patient. So whatever the patient, if the patient is coming with neurological symptoms, we will, and the patient is having COVID-19, we will shift the patient to the traumas. Once the triage is done, the patient is transported into the dedicated van for the COVID-19 patient to the trauma center. And then there, the complete therapy or complete treatment is provided to that patient. So change of physical location of neurocritical care unit based upon the resources for the care of infected patients, and better we look for the negative pressure isolation rooms where these type of patients can be better looked for. And it is a multimodal monitoring in critical ill persons with COVID-19. It enables the real-time detection of neurological complication. Like I have said, it is not the one diagnostic test. It is a multiple investigations. It can be invasive investigations, invasive monitoring, non-invasive monitoring. So it will help to identify the real-time detection of neurological complication. What is happening inside the brain? Suppose with a Doppler, we can know what is the real time, what is the at present, what is the intracranial pressure of the brain. So if ICP is high, we can immediately look for the intervention which will help to reduce the intracranial pressure and improve the cerebral circulation. So multimodal monitoring is, it helps to identify the clues which will help to provide a timely intervention for the prompt diagnosis and subsequent management. In continuing with the neurological monitoring, the common monitoring techniques, it include standard neurological examination. The standard neurological examination, which is for all patients with the neurological symptoms, it include Glasgow-Coma scales, pupil examination, deep tendon reflexes, sensory nerve examination, sensory examination, motor examination, deep tendon reflexes. So this all comes under standard neurological examination. Next is electroencephalogram, which will tell you about the electrical activity of the brain. Transcranial Doppler ultrasound sonography, pupillometry, optic nerve sheet diameter, near infrared spectroscopy, neuroimaging. Another one is cerebral angiogram, or the lumbar puncture is also there. Now starting with the electric encephalogram, continuous electroencephalography. It is a non-invasive tool. It's not invasive, it's a non-invasive tool that measures the cortical electrical activity. It is usually used in case of seizures, poor recovery after discontinuing sedations, and persistent encephalopathy. So EEG pattern, it shows the hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, because in COVID-19, what has been seen that the inflammatory cells, they bring out the hypoxic changes. So this hypoxia will lead to ischemia, and it will further reduce the cerebral circulation and loss of brain function. So it will detect that hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. It can range from generalized periodic discharges to burst suppression through electrographic silence. In patient with COVID-19, the most common EEG finding, what we have seen in this, what the studies have shown, that EEG finding, they show the left side sharps with the background slow abnormalities. So as you can see in this picture, the sudden sharp outburst with the background is quite slow. This is most commonly seen in the COVID-19 patients. So these patients were treated, it is a case, this picture has been taken from a case series for 3 patients, where it has shown the sudden outburst of electric rhythms followed by the background is quite slow. And then this patient were treated with the anti-epileptic drugs. So the next monitoring is transcutaneous Doppler sonography. So it is again a non-invasive method. It is a pulse Doppler ultrasound beam of 2 megahertz frequency to assess the hemodynamic state of circle of Willis. So complete cerebral vasculature can be assessed using this Doppler ultrasound. We can just keep a transducer on the patient head, and we can assess what is going on into the anterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, or the posterior cerebral artery. If in case there is what is the intracranial pressure at that point of time, or if there is any ischemia, any thrombosis, or what is the pressure which is there into the cerebral vasculature, that can be measured. The real-time measurement can be done without any invasive procedure. It is completely in a non-invasive procedure. So non-invasively, it measures the changes into the cerebral blood flow. If there is a high ICP, obviously cerebral perfusion is going to be decreased, and it can cause the dilatation of cerebral arteries. So this Doppler, it evaluates the cerebral blood flow into the large intracranial arteries, and it allow for real-time detection of acute large vessels occlusions, thrombi, or evolving cerebral edema. Otherwise, it was seen into the cerebral angiography also, but that is an invasive procedure. So with this non-invasive, using this Doppler ultrasound, we can see what is the occlusion or any emboli or any thrombus is there into that vessels, which can lead to increased intracranial pressure and decreased cerebral perfusion. As you can see, just putting that transducer, the person is measuring the pressure into the arteries, into the circle of Willis. So all the posterior, middle, and the anterior arteries, the cerebral arteries, the pressure is being measured and look for any embolism and the thrombus. The next investigation is automated pupillometry. This is again another non-invasive method in which the pupillometer is kept into the patient eye, patient pupil, and because one of the examination is the pupil examination, neurological examination is pupil examination also. We see the size of the pupil, the shape of the pupil, the reaction to the light. So this will tell you about the cranial nerve function, basically the oculomotor and the optic nerve. So this is another non-invasive method in which this meter is kept on the patient eye, and the size, latency, constrictions, dilatation, the percentage of constriction, everything is checked with this non-invasive method. We don't, patient doesn't need to be conscious for this. Even for it can be used even for an unconscious patient. Here you can see in this picture, the patient is unconscious with a neurological problem, and he with this closed eyelid only, this pupillometer is kept on the closed eyelid, and it is automatically measuring the pressures. So it is a non-invasive neuromonitoring modality, which is frequently used in neurocritical care units. So this neurological pupil index, it is a standardized measure of pupil size, constriction velocity, dilatation velocity. It may be the first sign of impending clinical deterioration. So if the ICP is increasing, obviously these changes are going to bring the changes into the pupil size, constriction velocity. So one can come to know something wrong is going into the brain. So cerebral perfusion is decreasing. So active measures can be taken to reduce the high ICP, like improving the oxygenation of the patient, planning the ventilation, better ventilation for the patient. So this way, reducing the high ICP and improving the cerebral circulation and improving the prognosis of the patient. So it can be measured by handheld quantitative automated pupillometer. This device measures quantitative variation in pupillary light reactivity by using infrared camera to record a video footage. Like sometimes if there's a high ICP, so what changes are happening into that pupil size, the reaction to the light. So it will show the complete video footage of 1 minute, 2 minutes, or whatever time the patient is being monitored for the changes into the pupillary surface. So next is neuroimaging, that covers the CT scan and MRI. These are the gold standards imaging methods. So cerebral computed tomography, here we can use either dye, or dye may not be used. So it detects acute cerebrovascular events, acute ischemic strokes, intracranial hemorrhage. Contrast medium injection for CT angiography, it detects the acute vascular occlusions or cerebral venous thrombosis. So basically it will cover all the any like vasculature defects, any thrombosis or emboli into this cerebral vessels. Magnetic resonance imaging, it is more sensitive than CT scan to detect the encephalitis, necrotizing encephalopathy, microbleeds, which may not appear into the CT scan, or any hypoxic injury into the COVID-19 patient. But the only thing is we have to shift the patient for this procedure from the ICU to this CT scan room or the MRI. Another is PET scan, that is positron emission tomography. PET is a gold standard for studying cerebral hemodynamics. It provides the quantitative in vivo measurement of cerebral blood flow, cerebral metabolic rate of oxygen, cerebral blood volume, oxygen extraction time. So complete hemodynamics can be studied using the PET scan. So as you can see, patient is shifted for this PET scan. Patient has to be shifted from ICU to these PET scan room, and then we can do a complete imaging of the patient and see the hemodynamics of which is like cerebral blood flow, perfusion pressure, ICP. So these all things can be monitored. Next, non-invasive procedure is optic nerve sheath diameter, that is also called ONST. This we usually use in our neuro ICU. So the optic nerve is a part of central nervous system, and it is surrounded by a dura sheath. It is just an anatomy. Just to start with anatomy, optic sheath nerve is a part of central nervous system, and it is surrounded by a dural sheath. So between the sheath and the white matter, there is a small 0.1 to 0.2 subarachnoid space, which communicate with the subarachnoid space surrounding the brain. So if there is any changes into the brain, so this the diameter will change. So this will tell that ICP is increasing into the brain. So in case of increased ICP, because of any reason, any inflammation, any tumor, or any thrombus or ischemia, if ICP is increasing, that sheath will expand. So that sheath which communicate with the optic nerve also, that also expand. So if it expand, the diameter will also change. So the changes in diameter into the nerve sheath, it can be visualized using this transocular ultrasound. So this is a very simple and non-invasive procedure. It can be done by any trained nurse also. So there is a correlation between the nerve sheath diameter and ICP. So if ICP increases, the diameter of optic nerve sheath is also changed. So the linear, it's just a probe is kept on the closed upper eyelid, and we can measure the optic nerve sheath diameter is evaluated 3 millimeter behind the retinal papilla. And this technique is very cheap, very efficient, and on the spot we can measure what is the ICP level and what is the diameter. Because if diameter is increased, obviously the ICP is also changed. And the examination takes around 5 minutes per patient. As you can see from this picture, optic nerve sheath diameter is being examined. And here in the second picture, the diameter, you can see the diameter with the diameter, the ICP can be monitored. The next monitoring is near infrared spectroscopy. So near infrared spectroscopy is non-invasive method of estimating cerebral oxygenation. It is based on reflectance oximetry and measured the light reflected from chromophores in the brain. As we are using the pulse oximetry, so it is same as the pulse oximetry, but we use it for the the light is reflected from the chromophores in the brain to derive the regional oxygen saturation. Like whatever the oxygen saturation is there into the brain cells, it will give you the exact value of that. So this is same like pulse oximetry. So here the name is near infrared spectroscopy. It interrogate arterial, venous, and capillary blood, and hence oxygen saturation. It represent the average value of these compartments. Like we can, for the whole brain, we can use this. We can take the electrodes of this instruments, and we can see what is the, at that point of time, what is the oxygen level or oxygen saturation into which compartment of the brain. So this technique indirectly, it measures the changes in cerebral blood flow, cerebral blood volume by detecting changes into the venous saturation. Obviously, if ischemia is there into the one side of the brain, then it will show the saturation of that compartment will be less than the other one. As you can see, this machine is having electrodes. These electrodes, we can put it on the side of the brain where we want to see the oxygen saturation level. So once the electrodes are put, it is a non-invasive, completely non-invasive method. Patient is there into that ventilator, patient is intubated, and on the patient brain, we are keeping on the different areas, we are keeping these electrodes, and we can measure the regional oxygen saturation level. Now coming to the nurse's role in neurocritical monitoring. Due to the complexity of neurological complication in COVID-19 patient, role of nurses in routine and repeated clinical examination is mandatory. All the nurses who are working into the neurocritical settings, they should be highly competent, knowledgeable, and skilled because bedside monitoring can be done by the nurses only. So nurses need to understand the importance of structured assessment and respond to rapidly changing patient needs. Suppose the GCS is coming down, they should be knowledgeable, and they should know that if GCS is coming down earlier, like at 9 a.m. if the GCS was around 12, and at 9:30 the GCS has come down to 10, so they have to inform to the doctor the pupillary changes are coming, so something wrong is going inside the brain, or ICP is increasing. They have to inform to the doctor so that patient can be taken for the further monitoring, and timely interventions can be taken. And first and the foremost thing is, like Cecilia ma'am has told, that protect ourselves. So protect ourselves into this COVID-19 period by using the full personal protective equipments, using that N95 masks, the complete surgical suits, using the as per the hospital and the national guidelines. Review bedside emergency equipments in all the shift, because anytime patient can have cardiac arrhythmias also, because we have seen it is a hypercoagulable state into the cardiovasculature structures also. So patient can have arrhythmia, patient can have cardiac arrest. So all emergency equipment should be there, in it should be checked in all the shift. Include overview of all identified key events in handover. Once the handover is given in all the shift, the patient, it has to be informed that whatever significant changes has happened, suppose GCS has come down, the pupillary size, pupil dilatation was found, or it has deteriorated, that has to be informed. And verbal communication with the patient to reduce pain and anxiety. Of course, patient can, though the patient is unconscious, still the patient can hear. So verbal communication is very, very important. Though the patient is unconscious, before starting any procedure, before doing any monitoring, patient has to be informed so that there is no further pain and anxiety. Because if there is a pain and anxiety, it will further increase the intracranial pressure and decrease the cerebral perfusion, and it will bring the further hypoxic changes into the brain. So neurocritical assessment at bedsides, nurses can grossly assess the neurological status at bedside using different scales. These are the standardized scales which every nurse in neurocritical settings she should use. That is Glasgow-Coma scale. The score is ranged from 3 to 5, 3 to 15. If the score is less than 8, then it shows a threatened airway. If the score is less than 3, then the patient is having significant brain injury, or patient is under the comatose state, and the score 15 is absolutely fine. ICP monitoring is to be done if patient is having intraventricular catheter. Confusion assessment scale using AVPU scale, focal motor and sensitive deficit, sensory deficit, deep tendon reflexes assessment, assessment of brainstem impairment, that is pupillary examination, absence of cough, irregular breathing, and cerebral ultrasound. As you can see, pupillary function test, in this we see the size of the pupils, the shape of the pupil, and the reaction to the light. So estimation of pupil size and shape, reaction to light, and the eye movement, which will tell you about the intactness of optic nerve and oculomotor nerve. So if there is any changes, any dilated pupil, that will show the head trauma, or it can be because of any midbrain injuries. So this is GCS scale having the three items: eye response, verbal response, and motor response. So the total score is 15. Comatose patient, the patient is the score totally unresponsive, the score is 3. Comatose patient or the severe head injury or when the threatened airway is GCS is 8. Once the patient GCS is 8, we have to think of definite airway of the patient, like intubation and putting the patient onto the positive pressure ventilation. This is ABPU scale: A for alert, B for response to voice, P for response to pain, and U for unresponsive person. This is usually used for the pre-hospital workers. Muscle strength, in that we give the scoring from 0 to 5. Like for 0, there is no movement of muscle contraction. For 5, complete active movement with full resistance. And 3 is active movement against gravity. But 2 score is given when active movement but gravity, patient is not able to move his limbs against the gravity. So this is just a checklist which every neurocritical unit should have. It includes, and all the nurse should be completely knowledgeable and competent enough to use this type of checklist, like mental status, cranial nerve examination, motor assessment, sensory assessments in upper limbs and lower limbs, reflexes, deep tendon reflexes like bicep reflex, brachioradialis, triceps, nutellar reflex, Achilles, and plantar response, and coordination and gait. Here I would like to highlight that it is not the responsibility of neurologist or neurosurgeon only to be competent enough or use this type of checklist. Every nurse who is trained into the critical care setting, they should be completely knowledgeable. They should know how to use it and how to do these type of tests. So it has to be done as per the hospital protocol. Neurocritical monitoring, it also include the ABG values, like if patient is going into the hypoxia or respiratory acidosis. So we have to improve the, we have to change the ventilator parameter. The main target is PaCO2 should not be more than 35 to, the main target is 35 to 40. It has to be kept. So if it increases, it will cause the cerebral vasodilation and further ICP is increased. So in that case, we have to change oxygenation level and increase the FiO2 of the patient. Continuous vital monitoring like heart rate, respiration, saturation of oxygen, blood pressure. If patient is having invasive line, arterial line, mean arterial pressure, central venous pressure, this has to be checked. Ventilator parameter, the other monitoring which is done under ventilator parameter is what type of ventilation, whether it is a pressure support or volume support, what type of ventilation is given, what is the PEEP which is set, so that with that PEEP, the ICP can be decreased, proper PEEP ICP can be decreased, and the alveoli remain inflated, and there's a better oxygenation of the patient. What is the FiO2 which is set, tidal volume, and pressure control or pressure support. RBS monitoring, the main target is the blood sugar should not go more than 140. So insulin has to be started if it is increasing more than 140, because it has been seen with the increase of blood sugar of more than 140, there is a ischemic changes into the brain. So glucose level above 7.8 millimoles were independent predictor of unfavorable outcome, because it reduces the cerebral circulation. Pain score has to be checked. Early urine output also has to be checked. And the main highlight in the monitoring is, due to high occurrence of brain complication during COVID-19, monitoring of cerebral function is very, very important. Clinical examination should be done routinely in all the patients, which is used to decide for neuroimaging, because even a small single clue like GCS is coming down, pupil change is there, ICP is increasing. So that will give us a clue that what's going on, what's going wrong, what immediate therapeutic intervention can be taken to improve the cerebral circulation and reduce the hypoxia. In heavily sedated or paralyzed patient, unreliable clinical examination, non-invasive monitoring could provide the additional information. Like patient is unconscious, when the closed upper eyelid only, we can check the optic nerve sheet diameter. We can see the pupil size with this non-invasive methods. In daily practice, trained nurses could obtain relative findings from cerebral ultrasound, cerebral near-infrared spectroscopy, quantified EEG, and automated pupillometry to assess the cerebral functions in COVID-19 critical ill patients. These are my references. So with this, I will end my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Seema, for the exhaustive presentation and for throwing light on the different monitoring parameters we have. So we also came to know about the non-invasive techniques, the ONSD, the infrared spectrometry, and everything. And ma'am also have highlighted the tool which can be used by the neuro nurses in the assessment at the bedside, and any clues can be any changes can be vital in the patient's outcome. So thank you, ma'am, once again. So with this, we finish our panel discussion.
Thank you, Sibi. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm audible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Complete panel discussion credit goes to CB ma'am, who have given the panel's sub topics and scheduling that, and ma'am organized the speakers and the communication done with the speakers. So ma'am did the great job that all half of my work was done by CB ma'am. Thank you so much for that. And I extend my thanks to all the panelists who have done the great job, and who have done the presentation very well and timely present as well as finishing. Is for that I'm really thankful to all of you, the chairperson of the panel discussion, as well as all the panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anjali.
Thank you.
With this, this 3 days conference comes to end. I would like to give the vote of thanks to the persons or members whoever contributed to this 3 days virtual conference. I would like to thank Conference Secretary Dr. Achal Srivastava and our Nursing Superintendent Ms. Ranjitkar ma'am for giving me an opportunity to organize this virtual conference, and this is the first experience for me to organize. This is because multiple normal conferences, physical conferences or workshops were organized previously, but virtual this is the first, and I hope that I coordinated with the esteemed faculties from the College of Nursing AIIMS. I feel that greatness that I got all the speakers from the prestigious institute. For that I'm great, and I also would like to thank the esteemed faculties of all the College of Nursing like AIIMS, RML, PG Chandigarh, who have given the wonderful presentations in these 3 days virtual conference. I would like to extend my thanks to clinical experts from AIIMS, all the senior nursing officers who have had the presentations today, yesterday, and the day before yesterday's also, and from the RML, the previous DNA organizers who have given the valuable contribution and coordination support to this conference also. So I'm grateful to them. And thank you for the participants, attendees, for your patience, listening, and spending time to gain the knowledge, and which has to be input in your daily practice. Everyday nursing care. So thank you so much all the participants. I also congratulate and thankful to the previous organizers, and also finally I would like to thank the event managers, Mrs. Sweta, Mr. Samrat, and Mr. Atul, and their co-team members for their tireless work to carry out the virtual session without any delay. For each and every session they carried out very well. For that I'm really, really grateful to them. Once again, thank you so much to all of you. If anybody's name is not mentioned here, I'm so sorry for that. And thank you to all of you, one and everyone, whoever coordinated with me, whoever supported for this conference. Thank you.